Bleeding hands, brave hearts. The cabin was already falling when Caleb Mercer heard the screams. Timber cracked like gunfire across the Montana Valley, and through the dust cloud rising from the collapsed homestead, he saw her. A young woman pinned beneath splintered beams, one arm wrapped around a bundle that wouldn't stop crying. No neighbors. No help coming. Just him, his horse, and the knowledge that every second he hesitated was a second closer to death for both of them. If you want to know whether love begins with rescue or becomes something more, stay until the end. Like this story, and comment what city you're watching from so I can see how far these Montana mountains reach. The spring of 1873 had painted Montana territory in shades of hope. Meadows thick with lupine, snowmelt rushing through creek beds, aspens unfurling tender leaves against a sky so blue it hurt to look at directly. Caleb Mercer had spent the morning tracking 3 Mustangs through the high country, work that required patience more than speed, silence more than skill. He'd been a horse wrangler for 7 years, ever since his father's death left him the trade and nothing else, and he'd grown comfortable with solitude the way some men grew comfortable with whiskey. He was walking his gelding along a ridgeline, giving the animal a rest after a hard climb, when the sound reached him. A scream. Not animal. Human. Female. Cut short, then rising again with the kind of desperation that bypassed thought and struck straight at instinct. Caleb spun toward the sound, his hand already on his rifle before his mind caught up. Below him, maybe half a mile down the slope, a thin column of dust rose from what should have been empty valley. He'd ridden this country enough to know there was a homestead tucked in the cottonwoods down there. Small operation, barely a year old, the kind of claim that showed more optimism than sense. The screaming continued. Then came a sound worse than screaming, a baby's cry, high and terrified. He didn't think. He mounted and kicked his horse into motion, guiding the gelding down the treacherous slope with the recklessness of a man who understood that some moments don't wait for careful consideration. Stones scattered beneath hooves, branches whipped his face. The baby's crying grew louder, more frantic, joined now by a woman's voice shouting words he couldn't yet make out. When he broke through the cottonwoods into the clearing, his stomach dropped. The cabin, if you could call the rough structure a cabin, had collapsed on itself like a house of cards. The roof beam, never properly supported, had given way on the south side, bringing down half the wall and most of the roof in a cascade of timber, sod, and broken dreams. Dust still hung in the air, making everything look like a daguerreotype, colorless and distant. But the crying was anything but distant. "Help! Please, someone help!" Caleb dismounted before his horse had fully stopped, his boots hitting dirt as his eyes scanned the wreckage. There, beneath a tangle of beams near what used to be the door, he saw her. A woman, maybe 25, pinned from the waist down by a heavy roof timber. Her face was streaked with dust and tears, her dark hair fallen loose from its pins, and in her arms, protected by her body but screaming with the fury of the terrified, was an infant wrapped in what had once been a clean blanket. "I'm here," Caleb called, already moving toward her, his mind racing through possibilities and discarding most of them as quickly as they formed. "I'm here. Stay still." "I can't. The baby, please. The baby." Her voice broke on the last word, and Caleb saw why. The beam across her legs was shifting slightly with each of the baby's movements, settling deeper into the debris. If it shifted the wrong way, it would crush her. If he tried to lift it without support, the whole remaining structure might come down on top of them both. He dropped to his knees beside her, his hands already assessing the situation with the quick efficiency of a man who'd spent his life working with his hands. The beam was lodged at an angle, one end buried in debris, the other resting on what remained of the door frame. Smaller boards and chunks of sod roof had fallen around and partially on top of her, but the real problem was that main beam, easily 400 pounds of green timber, settled in just wrong enough to trap her without quite crushing her. Yet. "What's your name?" he asked, keeping his voice level as he began clearing away the smaller debris around her. "Lena. Lena Hart." She gasped as he shifted a board near her hip. "The baby, Maisie, is she hurt?" Caleb glanced at the screaming infant, red-faced, furious, very much alive. "She's mad, not hurt." "That's good. Means she's breathing fine. How about you? Can you feel your legs? Yes, it hurts, but I can feel them. I was trying to get out when the beam fell. I got Maisie in my arms, but I couldn't. Her voice cracked again, and she pressed her face against the baby's head, her whole body shaking. You did exactly right, Caleb said firmly, already moving back to his horse. You protected her. Now I'm going to get you both out of here, but I need you to stay calm and stay still. Can you do that? Lena nodded, though her breathing was coming fast and shallow. Caleb grabbed his rope from the saddle, his mind working through the problem like a puzzle. He couldn't lift the beam, not without leverage, and there was nothing stable enough to use as a fulcrum. But if he could secure it to his horse and keep it from shifting while he cleared enough debris for her to slide out, it wasn't a good plan. It was just the only plan. He worked quickly, looping his lariat around the beam where it rested on the door frame, testing the knot twice before he was satisfied. Then he led his horse into position, playing out rope until he had the angle right. When I signal my horse to pull, he told Lena, this beam is going to lift just slightly and shift west. You'll have maybe 10 seconds, probably less, before the weight redistributes and it settles again. When I say go, you slide yourself backward, away from the cabin. Don't try to stand, don't try to help, just slide. Understand? What about Maisie? I'm going to take her first. No! Lena. He crouched beside her again, meeting her eyes directly. If this goes wrong, if that beam shifts the wrong way or the rest of the structure comes down, I need to know that baby is clear. I need you to trust me to come back for you. The calculation that crossed her face was painful to witness. The terrible mathematics of motherhood, weighing her own life against her child's, measuring trust in a stranger against the certainty of what would happen if she refused. Okay, she whispered finally. Okay? Caleb didn't waste time with reassurance. He positioned himself as close to her as the debris allowed and reached for the baby. Maisie's crying reached a new pitch as he lifted her from her mother's arms, and Lena made a sound that might have been a sob, or might have been a prayer. He cradled the infant against his chest with one arm, surprised by how small she was, how fragile, how her crying vibrated through his ribs like a living heartbeat. With his free hand, he carefully picked his way back through the wreckage, every step calculated to avoid shifting the precarious balance of broken timber. He laid Maisie on a blanket he'd spread on the ground, well clear of the cabin. She screamed her protest at the sky, her tiny fists waving, and he had never been so grateful for noise in his life. She's safe, he called back to Lena. Your turn. Are you ready? Yes. The word was barely audible, but steady. Caleb positioned himself at the beam, one hand on the rope, the other ready to help Lena as soon as she was clear. He clicked his tongue at his horse, and the well-trained gelding leaned into the rope. The beam groaned, lifted, shifted west exactly as Caleb had calculated. Go! Lena was already moving, dragging herself backward through the dirt with strength that spoke of pure determination. Her skirt caught on something, a nail, a splinter, and for one terrible second she was stuck, the beam already starting to settle back down. Caleb lunged forward, grabbed her under the arms, and pulled with everything he had. They tumbled backward together, hitting the ground hard just as the beam crashed down where she'd been lying, sending up another cloud of dust and debris. The rest of the cabin's wall groaned ominously, leaning further inward, and Caleb didn't wait to see if it would hold. He hauled Lena to her feet, supporting most of her weight, and half carried her away from the collapsing structure. They made it 20 feet before her legs gave out completely. He lowered her to the ground beside Maisie, and Lena immediately gathered the baby into her arms, her whole body curving around the infant as sobs finally broke through. Caleb stood over them, breathing hard, his hands shaking now that the immediate crisis had passed. Behind him, the cabin let out one final groan and collapsed completely, timber and sod falling inward with a crash that sent birds exploding from the cottonwoods. For a long moment, no one spoke. Lena rocked Maisie, crying too hard for words. The baby's screams had subsided to hiccuping whimpers. Caleb's horse snorted and shook its head, dislodging dust from its mane. Then Lena looked up at him, her face tracked with tears and dirt, and said, "Thank you, I can't, thank you." "Can you walk?" Caleb asked, his voice rougher than he intended. She tried to stand, made it halfway up before crying out in pain and collapsing back down. "My ankle, I think it's twisted." Caleb crouched beside her, his hands gentle as he examined her leg through her torn skirt. Her ankle was already swelling, the skin discolored. Sprained, probably. Maybe broken. Either way, she wasn't walking anywhere. "Where's your husband?" he asked. Something shuddered in her expression. Town. Silver Creek. He went 3 days ago for supplies. 3 days. Caleb looked around the clearing, taking in details he'd been too focused to notice before. No horse in the small corral, no smoke from a cooking fire. The cabin, what was left of it, had clearly been built by someone with more enthusiasm than skill, the kind of hasty construction that spoke of a man wanting to claim land without putting in the time to do it right. Anyone else nearby? Neighbors? The Johnsons, maybe 3 miles north, but we haven't. She looked down at Maisie, her jaw tight. We keep to ourselves. Translation. They'd worn out their welcome or never established any to begin with. Caleb had seen it before, young couples chasing the promise of free land and fresh starts, unprepared for how hard Montana could be, how unforgiving. Some made it. Most didn't. He made a decision. Silver Creek's about 12 miles southeast. I can get you there before sundown if we leave now. I can't impose. You're not imposing. You're accepting help. There's a difference. He stood, brushing dirt from his trousers. I'm going to make a travois. Get you and the baby comfortable. Then we're riding out. My things, ma'am, you don't have things anymore. You've got your daughter, your life, and whatever you're wearing. That cabin's gone. The bluntness made her flinch, but she nodded. Reality was setting in. He could see it in her eyes. The shock giving way to the terrible clarity of loss. Everything she owned, everything she'd built, reduced to splinters and dust in the time it took to draw 3 breaths. Caleb worked quickly, cutting saplings and lashing them together with rope, securing his bedroll across them to make a rough but serviceable platform. He'd made travois before for injured horses. The principle was the same, even if the cargo was more precious. Lena watched him work, Maisie dozing fitfully against her shoulder, and something about the silence between them felt less awkward than it should have. I'm Caleb, he said finally, testing the knots one more time. Caleb Mercer, horse wrangler. I work the territory between here and the Yellowstone, mostly. Lena Hart, she said, though he already knew. And this is Maisie, 4 months old. She paused. We came from Ohio, last autumn. Grant, my husband, he read about the Homestead Act and decided we should claim land before it was all gone. The way she said her husband's name, flat, careful, told Caleb more than the words themselves. Ohio's a long way to come, he said neutrally. Yes. That was all. Just yes. He helped her onto the travois, arranging the bedroll so she could sit with her back against his saddlebags, Maisie cradled in her lap. She bit her lip against the pain as he lifted her injured ankle, but didn't cry out. Tough, he thought. She'd need to be. The journey to Silver Creek was slow, the travois bumping over uneven ground despite Caleb's best efforts to choose smooth paths. The sun climbed higher, then began its descent, painting the mountains in shades of amber and rose. Maisie slept, then woke crying, then slept again. Lena didn't complain, though Caleb could see the pain etched deeper into her face with each mile. They stopped once so she could nurse the baby in privacy, Caleb walking his horse a respectful distance away and checking the travois lashings to give her time. When he returned, Maisie was sleeping again, and Lena was staring at the mountains with an expression he couldn't quite read. I've never seen them look so beautiful, she said quietly. Isn't that strange? Today of all days? Beautiful things don't stop being beautiful just because the world goes hard, Caleb said. Montana doesn't care much about our troubles. I'm starting to understand that. They rode on. The sun was touching the western peaks when Silver Creek finally came into view, a scatter of buildings along a creek that gave the town its name, maybe 200 souls at most, the kind of place that existed primarily to service the ranches and mining claims scattered across the surrounding territory. Caleb guided his horse down the main street, aware of the stairs following them, the way conversation stopped and started again in their wake. He pulled up in front of Ella Brennan's boarding house, a neat 2-story structure that was one of the few buildings in town painted instead of left raw wood. Ella herself was sweeping the porch, and she looked up at the sound of hooves, her eyes widening as she took in the sight. A dust-covered man leading a horse, pulling a travois, bearing a young mother with a baby, and an expression of complete devastation. "Mercy," Ella breathed, the broom clattering to the porch boards. "What happened?" "Her cabin collapsed," Caleb said, dismounting. "She needs a room, a doctor for that ankle, and probably just about everything else." Ella Brennan had run her boarding house for 15 years, and she'd seen every kind of tragedy the territory could produce. She didn't waste time with questions. "Bring her inside. I'll send my boy for Doc Harrison. You," she pointed at Caleb, "help her upstairs, then get yourself something to eat. You look like you've been dragged behind that horse, not riding it." Between them, they got Lena into a clean room on the second floor, Ella clucking and organizing like a general deploying troops. She took Maisie from Lena's arms despite the mother's protest, promising to bring the baby back as soon as she'd been properly cleaned and checked over. A girl of maybe 14 appeared with hot water and clean cloths. Another brought a tray with bread, cheese, and tea. Caleb stood awkwardly in the doorway, suddenly aware that his part in this story was probably over. He'd done what any decent person would do. Now the town's machinery of charity and curiosity would take over, and Lena Hart would become someone else's concern. "Thank you," Lena said again, looking at him from where she sat on the edge of the bed, her hands twisted together in her lap. "I don't know how to... I'll never be able to..." "You don't owe me anything," Caleb interrupted. "I'm glad I heard you. Glad I could help." He touched the brim of his hat. "Take care of yourself and that baby." He turned to leave. "Will you..." She stopped, started again. "Will you tell Grant what happened when you see him in town? I don't know where he's staying, but if you could..." Something in her voice made him turn back. "I'll ask around," he said. "See if I can find him." The relief on her face was painful to witness. She thought her husband would care. Thought he'd come running when he heard. Caleb had his doubts. A man who'd leave his wife and infant daughter alone in a poorly built cabin for 3 days probably wasn't going to win any prizes for devotion. But he kept those doubts to himself. He found Ella in the kitchen, organizing the chaos of care with the efficiency of long practice. "I need to find her husband," he said. "Grant Hart. He came to town 3 days ago. You know him?" Ella's expression went carefully neutral. "I know of him." "Where can I find him?" "Caleb." She set down the bowl she'd been holding and looked at him directly. "Maybe you should let the sheriff handle this." "Why would the sheriff need to handle it?" She sighed. "Because Grant Hart is dead." The words landed like stones. Caleb felt something cold settle in his chest. "How?" "Card game at the Lucky Devil, 2 nights ago. He accused Jimmy Crawford of cheating, which Jimmy probably was, but nobody could prove it, and things got heated. Jimmy drew first, witnesses say, and Grant went for his gun. Jimmy was faster." She shook her head. "Sheriff called it self-defense. Jimmy left town yesterday, and Grant's buried in the cemetery up on the hill. I'm sorry." Caleb looked toward the ceiling, thinking about the woman upstairs who'd just lost everything. Home, possessions, and now, though she didn't know it yet, her husband. A husband who'd died gambling instead of returning to his family. A husband who'd left them vulnerable and alone in a cabin that couldn't withstand a strong wind, let alone Montana spring. "I have to tell her," he said. "I can do it," Ella offered. "Might be easier coming from another woman." "No." Caleb surprised himself with the firmness of his own voice. "I pulled her out of that cabin. I brought her here. She asked me to find him. This is my responsibility." Ella studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "There's coffee on the stove. Drink some before you go up. You'll want something to steady yourself." But Caleb didn't want coffee. He wanted this conversation to be over. The hard truth delivered so whatever came next could start. He climbed the stairs with heavy steps, knocked gently on Lena's door. "Come in." She was sitting in a chair by the window, cleaned up now, her hair brushed and pinned, wearing what must have been a borrowed dress. Maisie was back in her arms, clean and sleeping. Lena looked up at him with hope in her eyes, and Caleb felt something break inside his chest. "Did you find him?" Caleb crossed the room and pulled up the other chair, sitting so they were at eye level. He'd never had to deliver news like this before, and he found himself wishing someone had taught him the right words, the gentle way to break a heart. But there were no right words. There was only the truth. I found out what happened to him, Caleb said carefully. Lena, I'm sorry. Grant died 2 nights ago. There was a fight at a saloon, a card game that went bad. The sheriff ruled it self-defense. He watched her face as the words landed, watched shock, disbelief, and then something more complicated. Grief, yes, but also something that looked almost like resignation. Her arms tightened around Maisie, but she didn't cry. She just stared at him, her eyes searching his face as if looking for proof that this wasn't real. He's buried at the cemetery, Caleb continued, his voice gentler than he'd known he could make it. I can take you there tomorrow if you want, or Ella can. You don't have to decide now. A card game, Lena said finally, her voice distant. He was playing cards while our cabin was falling down. You couldn't have known, couldn't I? She looked down at Maisie, her jaw working. He told me he was going for supplies. Flour, salt, nails to fix the roof. He promised he'd be back the next day. But I knew. I knew he'd find a game, find whiskey, find any reason not to come home. Her voice cracked. And I stayed anyway. I kept believing he'd change, that having Maisie would make him want to be better. But he didn't want to be better. He just wanted what he wanted. Caleb didn't know what to say to that kind of raw honesty, so he said nothing. He just sat with her while she stared out the window at a town that held her husband's grave, holding a baby who would never remember her father, processing a loss that seemed to hurt less than it should, and that fact hurting more than the loss itself. What am I going to do? She whispered finally. Tonight? Nothing. You're going to sleep. Let that ankle heal. Let Ella fuss over you and Maisie. Everything else can wait until tomorrow. I don't have any money. I can't pay for this room, for the doctor, for... Then you'll owe it and pay it back when you can. Or the town will cover it, or I will. It doesn't matter. He stood, his hat in his hands. What matters is you're safe and that baby's safe. The rest is just details. Lena looked up at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. Why are you being so kind to me? You don't know me. You don't owe me anything. I don't need to owe you to help you, Caleb said. That's not how it works. He left before she could respond, closing the door gently behind him. In the hallway, he leaned against the wall and let out a long breath, suddenly exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with the day's physical labor. Downstairs, Ella was waiting with that promised coffee and a plate of stew he hadn't asked for but was grateful to receive. He ate mechanically, tasting nothing, while she sat across from him and watched with knowing eyes. You planning to stay in town? She asked. I have work, horses to track. Mm-hmm. She sipped her own coffee. Those horses going anywhere urgent? Caleb thought about the Mustangs, wild and free in the high country, and the young widow upstairs with an infant and no future. No, he admitted. I suppose they're not. Ella smiled. Room's $5 a week, includes meals. I have a small one in the back that's empty. I didn't say... You didn't have to. She stood, collecting his empty plate. Get some rest, Caleb Mercer. Tomorrow's going to be another long day, I suspect. She was right about that, though neither of them could have known just how long or how much would change before the sun set again on Silver Creek. Caleb walked out into the evening air, the spring sky deepening to purple overhead, stars beginning to emerge like promises in the darkness. Somewhere up on the hill, a man he'd never met lay buried, his mistakes outliving him. Somewhere upstairs, a woman he'd known for less than a day held a sleeping baby and contemplated a future that must have seemed impossibly vast and terrifyingly empty. And Caleb, who'd spent 7 years choosing solitude over complication, whose life revolved around horses and sky and the simple satisfaction of work done well, felt something shift in his chest. Not attraction exactly. It was too soon for that, too complicated. But connection, maybe. Responsibility. The sense that some stories, once you stepped into them, didn't let you step back out until they'd run their course. He looked up at the lighted window where Lena's room was and made a decision that would shape everything that followed. He'd stay. Not forever. He wasn't fool enough to promise that, but long enough to make sure she landed on her feet, long enough to know she and Maisie would be all right. It was the least he could do. It was, he would learn, the most important thing he'd ever done. Morning came too bright and too early, sunlight slanting through the boarding house window like an accusation. Lena woke with Maisie whimpering against her chest and pain shooting through her ankle with every small movement. For one confused moment, she thought she was still in the cabin, still trapped beneath the beam, still screaming for help that wouldn't come. Then memory crashed back. The collapse, the stranger with bleeding hands, the impossible news delivered in a quiet voice. Grant was dead. The cabin was gone. Everything she'd brought from Ohio, every small possession that had made their rough life bearable, reduced to splinters and dust. She should cry. She knew that. Widows cried. But the tears wouldn't come, and that absence felt like its own kind of guilt. Maisie's whimpers escalated to full crying, the hungry kind that demanded immediate attention. Lena sat up carefully, testing her ankle, and found it swollen tight against the bandage Doc Harrison had wrapped the night before. Sprained, he'd said, not broken, which meant she'd heal, but it would take time. Time she didn't have. Time she couldn't afford. A soft knock at the door interrupted her spiraling thoughts. "It's Ella, dear. May I come in?" "Yes." The boarding house owner entered carrying a tray laden with more food than Lena had seen in weeks. Eggs, bacon, fresh bread, jam, milk still cold from the spring house. Behind her came the young girl from last night, her arms full of folded fabric. "This is my daughter Sarah," Ella said, setting the tray on the small table by the window. "She's brought you some clothes. They might be a bit large, but they're clean and whole, which is more than can be said for what you arrived in." Lena looked at the torn, dust-stained dress draped over the chair and felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I can't accept charity." "It's not charity. It's neighborliness. There's a difference." Ella's tone was firm but kind. "Now Sarah's going to help you wash up and change while I take this sweet girl downstairs for a proper feeding. Don't argue. You can't nurse properly on an empty stomach, and Maisie needs you strong." Before Lena could protest further, Ella had scooped up the baby with the practiced ease of someone who'd raised 5 children of her own. Maisie's crying paused in surprise, then resumed at a lower volume, more bewildered than distressed. "We'll be in the kitchen," Ella said. "Take your time, and eat every bite of that breakfast, you hear me?" When they were gone, Sarah helped Lena stand and hobbled to the wash basin. The girl worked with quiet efficiency, heating water, laying out soap and towels, her young face carefully neutral in a way that suggested she'd been instructed not to ask questions. "How old are you?" Lena asked, needing to fill the silence with something other than her own thoughts. 14, ma'am. 15 next month." "Do you go to school?" "Used to. Teacher left last fall, and nobody's replaced him yet." Sarah wrung out a cloth and handed it to Lena. "Mama says maybe in the autumn someone new will come, but folks are more worried about getting crops in than education right now." Lena washed her face, her neck, her arms, watching the water turn gray with dirt and grief. A teacher. The town needed a teacher. The thought lodged in her mind like a seed finding soil, but she pushed it aside. She couldn't think about futures when the present was barely holding together. The clothes Sarah had brought were simple. A work dress of sturdy brown cotton, a shawl, undergarments that had been mended but were clean. They hung loose on Lena's frame, evidence of too many meals stretched thin, too many months of Grant prioritizing whiskey over food. But they were whole and decent, and Lena felt something loosen in her chest as she buttoned the dress. She could face the world in borrowed clothes better than in rags. Downstairs, the kitchen was warm with cooking smells and crowded with women. Ella stood at the stove, Maisie content in a makeshift cradle fashioned from a wooden crate lined with blankets. 3 other women sat around the table, their conversation pausing as Lena entered on Sarah's supporting arm. "There now?" Ella said. "Ladies, this is Lena Hart. Lena, this is Martha Johnson, Claire Peterson, and Ruth Miller. They've come to help." Help. The word carried weight Lena wasn't sure she could bear. She lowered herself into the chair Sarah pulled out, her ankle throbbing, and faced the women who'd come to catalog her disaster. Martha Johnson was a square-built woman with capable hands and eyes that missed nothing. "My husband and I have the claim north of where you were. I'm sorry we didn't know you better. Sorry we didn't check on you more often." "We kept to ourselves," Lena said quietly. "That was our choice." "Well, it's not your choice now." Claire Peterson was younger, maybe 30, with red hair escaping from her bun and a direct manner that might have been off-putting if her eyes weren't so kind. You're part of this community whether you like it or not, and communities take care of their own. Ruth Miller, oldest of the three with silver threading her dark hair, leaned forward. We've taken up a collection. It's not much, $23, but it's yours, for immediate needs. Lena stared at the small pile of coins and bills on the table. $23. More money than she'd seen in months. More kindness than she knew how to accept. I can't. You can and you will, Ella interrupted, sliding a plate of food in front of her. Now eat. You can argue about it later when you have the strength. The food was as good as it looked, and Lena found herself eating with an appetite she hadn't felt in months. Around her, the women talked in low voices, planning her life with the same efficiency they'd used to plan a church social. She'll need boots. Those slippers won't last a week. And a proper coat. Winter comes early up here. What about work? Can she sew? The hotel needs a laundress, but that's hard on the hands. Lena set down her fork. I can teach. The conversation stopped. 4 pairs of eyes turned to her. I was a teacher in Ohio, she continued, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. Before I married, I taught reading, writing, arithmetic, history. Sarah mentioned the school needs someone. Martha and Claire exchanged glances. Ruth sat back in her chair, arms crossed, assessing. The last teacher was a drunk who left owing money to half the town, Martha said bluntly. Before that, we had a nice young man who lasted 2 months before his wife made him move back to civilization. The school board's been burned twice. They're not eager to hire again. I'm not a drunk, and I'm not leaving. Lena looked down at Maisie, sleeping peacefully in her crate. I have nowhere to go. This is my home now, whether I chose it or not. I can teach your children. I want to teach them. It doesn't pay much, Claire warned. Maybe $30 a month, and only during school terms. Summer you'd have to find other work. $30 a month. It was nothing and everything. It was survival. It was dignity. It was a reason to get up in the morning beyond just feeding Maisie and counting the days until the next disaster struck. I'll take it, Lena said. If they'll have me. I'm on the school board, Ruth said, along with Pastor Williams and Henry Chen, who runs the Mercantile. I can't promise anything, but I can get you an interview. That's a start. It was more than a start. It was a lifeline, and Lena grabbed it with both hands. The women left an hour later, promising to return with more clothes, more advice, more help that Lena was learning to accept, if not quite believe she deserved. Ella shooed her back upstairs to rest, taking Maisie with promises to bring her up for nursing in a few hours. Alone in her room, Lena lowered herself onto the bed and finally let herself feel the full weight of everything that had happened. Grant was dead. She was a widow at 25. Her daughter would grow up without a father, not that Grant had been much of one in the 4 months since Maisie's birth, but still. The permanence of it pressed against her chest like that beam had pressed against her legs, inescapable and crushing. But beneath the grief and the shock, beneath the fear and the uncertainty, Lena felt something else stirring. Something that felt almost like relief. She was free. The thought came unbidden and brought guilt with it, but it was true nonetheless. Free from waiting for Grant to come home drunk or not at all. Free from listening to his grand plans that never materialized, his promises that broke as easily as they were made. Free from the particular loneliness of being married to someone who resented your presence even as he needed your labor. She'd loved him once, or thought she had. The handsome boy with big dreams who'd courted her with poetry and promises of adventure. But that boy, if he'd ever really existed, had died long before Jimmy Crawford's bullet found him. He'd died somewhere between Ohio and Montana, buried under whiskey and disappointment, and the bitter realization that free land wasn't actually free, that dreams required work he wasn't willing to do. And now Lena could grieve the loss of who she'd hoped he'd be without the daily weight of who he actually was. A knock at the door pulled her from these dangerous thoughts. It's Caleb Mercer, ma'am. Ella said you were awake. I can come back if... No, come in. Lena smoothed her borrowed dress, suddenly aware of her unpinned hair, her tear-swollen eyes, the intimacy of allowing a man into her bedroom even with the door open and voices carrying from downstairs. Caleb entered carrying his hat, his hands still wrapped in bandages from yesterday's work. He looked uncomfortable, out of place in the neat room with its feminine touches, and Lena felt an unexpected rush of gratitude for his awkwardness. He wasn't comfortable with this either, this strange dance of disaster and duty. "I wanted to check on you before I headed out," he said. "Make sure you had everything you needed." "You're leaving? Just for a few days? I have horses to track. It's my work. I can't just abandon it. But I'll be back by Friday. I wanted you to know." Lena didn't know why it mattered that he'd be back, why the thought of him leaving made something tighten in her chest. He'd done his duty and more. He owed her nothing. But she heard herself say, "Thank you for telling me. Also, I settled your bill with Doc Harrison, and I told Ella to put your room and board on my account for the next 2 weeks. That should give you time to—" "No!" Lena struggled to sit up straighter, ignoring the protest from her ankle. "I can't accept that. You've already done too much. I haven't done anything that needs repaying. Mr. Mercer, Caleb." "Caleb, then. I appreciate your kindness, truly, but I won't be a charity case. I won't be the poor widow everyone takes pity on. The women from town brought me money this morning, $23. I can pay my own way." Caleb crossed the room and sat in the chair by the window, his long legs stretched out in front of him. "That $23 needs to buy you boots, a coat, supplies for Maisie, and food for however long it takes you to find work. It needs to be your cushion against the next disaster, because in Montana there's always a next disaster. It can't also cover doctor bills and 2 weeks at the boarding house." "I have work. Ruth Miller is getting me an interview to teach." "That's good. That's real good." He studied her face. "But even if you get it, school won't start until fall. That's 4 months away. What are you going to do until then?" The question hung in the air between them, unanswerable and unavoidable. Lena looked down at her hands, work-roughened and empty. "I'll find something. Washing, mending, cooking. I'll manage." "I'm sure you will. You seem like the managing type." There was no mockery in his voice, just observation. "But managing doesn't mean you have to do it alone. Let me help. Not because you're charity, but because I want to. Because I pulled you out of that cabin, and I'd like to know the effort meant something beyond just keeping you alive for one more day." Lena looked up at him, the stranger who'd risked his life for hers, who kept showing up when he could have walked away. His face was weathered from years of outdoor work, his hands scarred and capable, his eyes steady in a way Grant's never had been. He looked like someone who kept his promises, who said what he meant and meant what he said. 2 weeks, she said finally. "After that, I pay my own way. Agreed?" "Agreed." Caleb stood, settling his hat on his head. "I'll be back Friday. If you need anything before then, tell Ella. She knows how to reach me if it's urgent." He was almost to the door when Lena called after him. "Caleb, why are you doing this? Really?" He paused, his back to her, silent for so long she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet. "My mother died when I was 12. Cabin fire. My father tried to save her, burned his hand so bad he never could work the same again. We had neighbors who helped, brought food, paid for the doctor, gave my father work he could still do. They didn't know us well. We'd been on our claim less than a year, but they helped anyway, and because they did, my father and I survived. We got through." He turned to face her. "I guess I'm paying that forward, making sure kindness doesn't die out just because the country's hard. I'm sorry about your mother." "Me too. But she'd have liked knowing her death taught me something about living." He touched the brim of his hat. "Take care of yourself, Lena Hart. I'll see you Friday." When he was gone, Lena sat in the chair he'd vacated and looked out the window at Silver Creek, this town that was becoming hers, whether she'd chosen it or not. Somewhere out there was a cemetery where Grant lay buried, and she knew she should feel more about that than she did. Should feel devastation, heartbreak, the crushing weight of loss. But mostly what she felt was tired, and cautiously, carefully hopeful. Ella brought Maisie up an hour later, and Lena nursed her daughter by the window, watching the town go about its business. She saw Ruth Miller enter the mercantile, probably to speak with Henry Chen about the teaching position. Saw Martha Johnson loading supplies into a wagon, her movements efficient and practiced. Saw life continuing the way it always did, indifferent to individual tragedy, but somehow absorbing it anyway, making space for grief while insisting the world keep turning. 3 days later, dressed in her borrowed brown dress with her hair pinned carefully beneath a borrowed bonnet, Lena stood in front of the Silver Creek School Board for the interview that would determine her future. The schoolhouse was a single room with rough benches, a battered desk, and a chalkboard that had seen better days. Pastor Williams was a soft-spoken man in his 50s who asked about her religious education. Henry Chen, the mercantile owner, wanted to know if she could keep discipline. Ruth Miller simply asked her to teach. "Give us a sample lesson," Ruth said. "Pretend we're your students. Show us what you can do." Lena stood at the front of the empty classroom, her ankles still aching but healing, and looked at the three adults who held her future in their hands. She thought about Ohio, about the classroom where she'd first fallen in love with teaching. She thought about Maisie, sleeping in Ella's kitchen, depending on her mother to build a life worth living. And then she taught. She taught them about the alphabet, turning letters into stories. She taught them arithmetic using coins and apples and practical problems. She taught them about Montana Territory, about the land they lived on, about the history that had brought them all here. She taught for 30 minutes that felt like 30 seconds, and when she finished, the room was quiet. Henry Chen spoke first. $30 a month. School runs September through May with a month off at Christmas. You provide your own housing and supplies. The town provides the schoolhouse, firewood, and chalk. Agreed? Lena's heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. Agreed. Then welcome to Silver Creek, Mrs. Hart. School starts the first Monday in September. We'll expect you ready to teach 25 students ranging from 6 to 16. She walked back to the boarding house with her head high, despite the limp, despite the borrowed clothes, despite everything. Ruth Miller walked beside her, talking about curriculum and expectations, but Lena barely heard the words. She had work. She had purpose. She had a future she'd built with her own capabilities, not one handed to her through marriage or rescue. That evening, she sat with Ella in the kitchen after the other boarders had gone to their rooms. Maisie dozed in her arms, milk-drunk and peaceful. "You did good today," Ella said, mending a torn sheet with quick, efficient stitches. "Heard it from Ruth. She said you taught circles around that drunk they had last year." "I need to find permanent housing before September, somewhere I can afford on a teacher's salary. There's a small cabin behind the church, used to be the parsonage before Pastor Williams built his house. It's not much, but it's sound. I could speak to him about renting it to you. I'd appreciate that." Ella set down her mending and looked at Lena directly. "You know folks are going to talk. Young widow, strange man paying her bills, living on her own with a baby. You need to be prepared for that. Let them talk, I know the truth. The truth doesn't always matter when people are determined to gossip." Ella's expression softened. "But for what it's worth, I think Caleb Mercer's a good man. I've known him 5 years, and I've never seen him act dishonorably. Whatever kindness he's shown you, it's genuine." "I know." And she did know somehow, knew it in the same instinctive way she'd known Grant's promises were empty, even as she'd wanted to believe them. "He'll be back Friday." "Yes, he will." Ella picked up her mending again, a small smile playing at her lips. "And I suspect he'll keep coming back, interview or no interview, teaching position or no teaching position. That man's got a protective streak wide as the Missouri, and you've caught his attention." "I'm not looking for another husband." "Didn't say you were, but sometimes life gives us what we need instead of what we're looking for, and it's wise to know the difference." Friday came with rain, the first real storm since the cabin collapse. Lena stood at her window and watched lightning crack across the sky, remembering the sound of timber splitting, of her own voice screaming for help. She held Maisie closer and whispered promises into her daughter's soft hair. Promises about safety and stability and a life where walls stayed standing. When Caleb arrived just before supper, rain-soaked and leading a horse that looked as tired as he did, Lena was in the kitchen helping Ella prepare the evening meal. She heard his boots on the porch, heard his voice asking after her, and felt something warm uncurl in her chest that had nothing to do with the cooking fire. "You're back," she said, turning from the stove with a wooden spoon still in her hand. "Said I would be." He stood in the doorway, dripping water onto Ella's clean floor, and smiled. "Heard you got the teaching position. Congratulations." "Thank you. I start in September." "That's good. That's real good." He glanced at Ella, then back at Lena. "I was wondering if you'd like to take a walk tomorrow. If your ankle's up to it, There's something I'd like to show you. Lena knew she should say no, knew that walking out with a man, even in daylight, even in full view of the town, would start tongues wagging, knew that the smart thing, the safe thing, was to keep her distance and her reputation intact. But she also knew that Caleb Mercer had pulled her from the wreckage of her old life with bleeding hands and had asked nothing in return. That he'd told her about his mother and made her feel less alone. That when he looked at her, he saw someone capable and strong, not someone who needed saving. "I'd like that," she said. "My ankle's much better." His smile widened. "Good. I'll come by after breakfast." That night, Lena lay in her borrowed bed in her borrowed room, listening to Maisie's soft breathing and the rain against the windows. In 4 days, she'd lost a husband, gained a profession, and found something she couldn't quite name but felt like the first green shoots after a long winter. Tomorrow, she'd walk out with Caleb Mercer and see what he wanted to show her. Tomorrow, she'd take another step into this new life she was building from the ruins of the old. And for the first time since that beam had fallen, Lena felt something stronger than fear. She felt possibility. The morning dawned clear and cool, the storm having scrubbed the sky clean and left everything smelling of wet sage and possibility. Lena dressed carefully in the best of her borrowed clothes, a dark blue cotton dress that Claire Peterson had brought by with the shy admission that it had never fit her quite right, but might suit Lena just fine. She pinned her hair with more care than usual, then immediately unpinned it and did it again more simply, annoyed with herself for caring how she looked. This wasn't courtship. This was gratitude, maybe friendship, nothing more. Caleb had been clear about his intentions. He wanted to help, to pay forward the kindness his family had received. The fact that her heart had beat faster when she'd heard his voice in the kitchen meant nothing except that she was lonely and he was kind, and she'd learned the hard way not to confuse kindness with love. Ella was feeding Maisie mashed apple when Lena came downstairs, and the older woman's knowing smile made Lena's cheeks warm. "She'll be fine with me," Ella said before Lena could offer to stay. "Sarah's going to help, and between us we've raised enough babies to manage one more for a few hours. You go on and enjoy the sunshine while it lasts. You should stop arguing and accept that people want to help you." Ella's tone was gentle but firm. "That baby needs a mother who remembers how to smile, Lena Hart. Go find out if you still can." Caleb was waiting on the porch, his hat in his hands, looking as uncertain as she felt. He'd cleaned up since yesterday, his shirt pressed and his hair still damp from washing, and Lena realized with a start that he was nervous too. Somehow, that made everything easier. "Ready?" he asked. "Yes, where are we going?" "You'll see." They walked through town together, Lena's ankle protesting only slightly, and she was acutely aware of the eyes following them from windows and doorways. Mrs. Patterson paused her sweeping to stare. Old Tom Miller tipped his hat with a grin that suggested he knew exactly what they were up to, even though they weren't up to anything. By tomorrow, the whole town would have them engaged or scandalously involved, or both, and there was nothing Lena could do about it except hold her head high and keep walking. "Does it bother you?" Caleb asked quietly as they left the main street behind. "The gossip." "It bothers me that I care about it bothering me," Lena admitted. "I should be above caring what people think, but I'm going to be teaching their children in September. My reputation matters." "Your reputation is that you survived a cabin collapse, buried your husband with dignity, and earned a teaching position through your own merit. Anyone who thinks less of you for taking a walk in broad daylight with a man who helped you isn't worth your concern." Easy to say when you're not the one they're talking about. "Oh, they're talking about me too, wondering what my angle is, whether I'm trying to take advantage of a vulnerable widow, whether I'm fool enough to take on another man's child." He glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "I've heard it all in the mercantile, the saloon, the feed store. Small towns don't keep secrets well." "And what do you tell them?" "Nothing. Let them wonder. The truth's not their business." They'd reached the edge of town now, following a path that led toward the creek. The water ran high from the storm, rushing over stones with a sound like constant conversation. Cottonwoods lined the banks, their leaves bright green and shimmering in the breeze, and wildflowers dotted the meadow beyond. Lupine and Indian paintbrush and varieties Lena didn't know the names for yet. It's beautiful, she said softly. It is, but that's not what I wanted to show you. Caleb gestured to a spot where the path forked, one branch following the creek, the other climbing a gentle rise. This way! They took the rising path, Lena's breath coming harder as the slope increased. Caleb matched his pace to hers, never rushing, occasionally offering his arm when the ground grew rough. At the top of the rise, he stopped and pointed. There. Lena looked and felt her breath catch. Below them, nestled in a small valley where the creek widened into a lazy curve, sat a homestead. Not a rough cabin like the one that had collapsed on her, but a real house, small but solid, built from milled lumber with a stone chimney and glass windows that caught the morning sun. Behind it stood a barn in better repair than most she'd seen, and beyond that fenced pastures where a handful of horses grazed. That's my place, Caleb said quietly. I built it over 5 years, piece by piece. Started with just the barn and lived in it through 2 winters while I saved enough for lumber. Built the house the 3rd year, added the chimney the 4th. It's not fancy, but it's sound, storm-proof, built to last. Lena stared at the homestead, trying to understand why he'd brought her here. It's lovely. It's lonely. The words came out rougher than he probably intended. I built it thinking I'd need the space eventually, that I'd find someone to share it with. But the work kept me busy, and the years kept passing. And here I am at 32 with a house too big for one person and no prospects of that changing. Caleb, I'm not proposing, he interrupted, his cheeks flushing. God, that came out wrong. I just wanted you to see that I'm not some drifter with nothing to offer, that I have roots here, a life here, that when I say I want to help you, it's not charity and it's not pity, it's... He stopped, struggling for words. It's what? Lena asked gently. He turned to face her fully, his eyes searching hers with an intensity that made her chest tighten. I pulled you out of that cabin, and for a minute I thought I was too late. I thought you and Maisie were going to die right there in front of me, and there wouldn't be a damn thing I could do about it. And then you lived, you both lived, and I felt like I'd been given something, a second chance to do things right, to be the kind of man who doesn't walk away when things get hard. You barely know me. I know you're stronger than you think you are. I know you fought for your daughter when that beam was crushing you. I know you took a teaching job instead of looking for another husband to solve your problems, which means you value independence over security. I know when you look at those mountains, you see beauty instead of threat, which means Montana hasn't broken you yet. He paused. And I know that when I'm tracking horses in the high country, I think about you and Maisie back in town, and I want to make sure you're all right. Want it more than I've wanted anything in a long time. Lena's throat tightened with emotions she didn't know how to name. She'd married Grant for love, or what she'd thought was love. The breathless, reckless kind that felt like falling and promised to feel like flying. It had been neither. It had been slow disappointment, steady diminishment, the gradual understanding that the man she'd loved existed only in her imagination. What Caleb was offering felt different, steadier, like ground that wouldn't shift beneath her feet. I can't, she said, hating how the words hurt to say. I can't be what you need, Caleb. I'm broken in ways I don't even understand yet. My husband's been dead less than 2 weeks, and I should be devastated, but instead I feel relieved. And what kind of person does that make me? I have a daughter to raise, a job to prepare for, a whole life to rebuild from nothing. I don't have room for whatever this is. I'm not asking for room. I'm asking for time. Time to prove that not every man is Grant Hart. Time for you to heal enough to trust again. Time for us to figure out if this, he gestured between them, is something real or just 2 lonely people finding comfort in each other. And if it's just comfort, then we'll be friends, and that'll be enough. He said it simply, like he meant it, and Lena wanted desperately to believe him. I need to focus on Maisie and the teaching position. That has to come first. I wouldn't expect anything else. And I won't let people in town think I'm some woman who jumps from one man's bed to another before her husband's even cold in the ground. Then we'll be so proper it'll bore them to tears. No walks without a chaperone. No visits without Ella present. Nothing that gives anyone ammunition. He smiled slightly. Though I reserve the right to help you move furniture when you get that cabin behind the church, because that's just neighborly. Despite everything, Lena felt her lips curve into an answering smile. Just neighborly. Completely above reproach. They stood there on the rise, looking down at Caleb's homestead and the valley beyond, and something settled between them. Not a promise exactly, not even an agreement, just an understanding that whatever happened next would happen slowly, carefully, with both of them choosing each step instead of being swept along by circumstance or desperation. "Thank you for showing me this," Lena said finally, "for being honest about what you want. Thank you for not running screaming in the opposite direction. The day's not over yet." His laugh was startled and genuine, and it made something warm bloom in Lena's chest. When was the last time she'd made someone laugh? When was the last time she'd laughed herself, really laughed, instead of just going through the motions of living? They walked back to town by a different path, this one following the creek more closely. Caleb pointed out plants as they went, wild roses that would bloom in June, chokecherries that made excellent jam, yarrow that could be used for medicine. His knowledge was practical and deep, the kind that came from years of paying attention, and Lena found herself hungry for it. She'd spent so much time just surviving that she'd forgotten to learn the land she lived on. "My students will need to know these things," she said, touching the leaves of a sage plant he'd identified. "Not just book learning, but how to live here. I could help with that. Come talk to the class about horses, about reading the land, if you wanted. I'd like that." And she would. She could already picture it, Caleb standing in front of her students, teaching them things their parents might not think to teach, giving them tools for the lives they'd actually lead instead of the lives some distant curriculum thought they should lead. When they reached the boarding house, Ella was on the porch with Maisie in her arms, both of them looking content in the afternoon sunshine. The baby's face lit up when she saw Lena, and Lena felt her heart squeeze with fierce protective love. "Did she give you any trouble?" Lena asked, taking Maisie and breathing in her daughter's sweet baby smell. "Not a bit. She's an angel." Ella's eyes moved between Lena and Caleb, reading things that Lena wasn't sure were written yet. "You two have a nice walk." "Very nice," Lena said. "Caleb showed me his homestead." "Did he now?" Ella's smile was knowing. "That's quite an honor. He doesn't show that place to just anyone." Caleb shifted his weight, suddenly looking like a boy caught stealing apples. "I should get going. Need to check on some things at the livery." He touched his hat brim. "Mrs. Brennan, Lena, I'll see you both soon." He was halfway down the street before Ella spoke again. "That man's falling in love with you?" "Don't be ridiculous. We barely know each other. Love doesn't wait for long acquaintance. Sometimes it just shows up and starts making itself at home whether you're ready or not." Ella held the door open, following Lena inside. "Question is, what are you going to do about it?" "Nothing. I'm going to focus on Maisie and my teaching position and building a stable life." "Mm-hmm. And when he keeps showing up, when he keeps helping, when he keeps looking at you like you hung the moon and you start looking back?" Lena didn't have an answer for that. She carried Maisie upstairs and spent the rest of the afternoon playing with her daughter, reading to her from one of the books Ella had lent them, trying not to think about blue eyes and calloused hands and a house built to last. The next week passed in a blur of activity. Pastor Williams agreed to rent her the cabin behind the church for $8 a month. And the day Lena signed the agreement, she felt like she'd signed something far more significant than a lease. She had a home, her own home. A place that no one could take away as long as she made her payments, a place where she and Maisie could build a life. The cabin needed work. The windows wanted washing, the floor needed scrubbing, the walls could use fresh whitewash. But the roof was sound, and the door hung straight, and the small iron stove drew clean. Lena stood in the empty space and felt possibility fill her lungs like fresh air. Caleb appeared the next morning with lumber for shelves and offered to help install them if she wanted. Ella came with him, ostensibly to supervise but really to serve as chaperone, and between the three of them they transformed the rough space into something livable. Martha Johnson brought a table and 2 chairs her children had outgrown. Claire Peterson contributed curtains. Ruth Miller arrived with a crate full of kitchen supplies and a knowing look that said she understood exactly what it meant to start over with nothing. By the end of June, Lena and Maisie had moved out of the boarding house and into their own home. It wasn't much. One room that served as kitchen, bedroom, and living space, with barely enough space for the bed, the table, and a cradle Caleb had built during his evenings, but it was theirs. The first night in this cabin, Lena sat at her new table with Maisie asleep in her new cradle and tried to write a letter to her sister back in Ohio that had transformed her life, but the words wouldn't come. How could she explain that Grant's death had freed her? That losing everything had somehow given her more than she'd ever had? That a stranger's kindness had shown her what partnership could look like when it was chosen instead of desperately grabbed? She put the pen down and looked around her small home, her safe home, her earned home. Tomorrow she'd start preparing for the school year, reviewing curricula, planning lessons, making lists of supplies she'd need. Tomorrow she'd begin the work of becoming the teacher Silver Creek needed. But tonight, she just sat in the quiet and let herself feel grateful. July brought heat and the kind of hard work that left Lena exhausted but satisfied. She took in mending and washing to supplement the money the town women had given her. Her hands roughening again with labor she didn't resent because it was hers. She spent her evenings preparing for school, writing lesson plans by lamplight while Maisie played on a blanket at her feet. Caleb came by twice a week, always with Ella or Sarah in tow, always with some practical purpose, fixing a loose board, adjusting the stove flue, building a small fence for a garden plot. They talked while he worked, and Lena found herself sharing things she'd never told anyone. About her childhood in Ohio, her father who'd died when she was 12, her mother who'd remarried quickly and made it clear Lena was in the way. About meeting Grant at a church social and seeing in him an escape from being unwanted. About the slow realization that she'd traded one kind of unwantedness for another. Caleb listened without judgment, his hands busy with hammer or saw, and sometimes he shared his own stories. About his father drinking himself to death 5 years after his mother's death, leaving Caleb alone at 17. About learning the horse trade from a crow man who'd taught him to read the land and the animals on it. About building his homestead piece by piece, determined to create something permanent in a place where nothing felt permanent. "Do you ever get lonely out there?" Lena asked one evening while he was installing a proper latch on her door. "Every day. But there's a difference between being alone and being lonely. Alone is just a fact. Lonely is what happens when you want company and don't have it." He tested the latch, satisfied with how it caught. "I'm alone most of the time, but I'm only lonely when I let myself think about what I don't have instead of what I do." "And what do you have?" He looked at her directly, his eyes honest. "Work I'm good at, land I've earned, friends who'd help if I asked, and lately, the company of a woman who makes me laugh, and a baby who drools on my shirt without apologizing." He touched the wet spot on his shoulder where Maisie had indeed drooled while he was holding her earlier. "That's more than a lot of men can claim." Lena felt heat rise in her cheeks. "Caleb, I know, too soon, too fast. I'm just being honest about what I feel, not asking you to feel it back." He gathered his tools, giving her space. "You're doing remarkable things here, Lena. Building a life, preparing to shape young minds. Don't let anyone, including me, make you feel like you need more than what you're creating." After he left, Lena sat with Maisie and wondered what it meant that his absence made her cabin feel emptier than it had before he'd arrived. August came with thunderstorms and the first hints of autumn in the air. School would start in 3 weeks, and Lena threw herself into final preparations with focused intensity. She cleaned the schoolhouse until it gleamed, organized supplies, made lists of students and their ages and what she knew of their abilities. She met with parents who wanted to discuss their children's education, and she listened to their concerns about whether a widow could really handle the job, whether she'd be too soft or too distracted or too something. She smiled and assured them she was fully capable, and when they left, she closed her door and let the anger come. How dare they question her competence when they'd hired a drunk last year? How dare they worry about her being distracted when most of the fathers in town spent their evenings at the saloon? How dare they act like being a widow made her less instead of more? But she knew the answer. She was a woman alone, and that made people nervous, made them wonder what she wanted, what she might take, whether she'd disrupt the comfortable order of their town. Never mind that she just wanted to teach their children and raise her daughter. Never mind that she asked nothing from anyone except the dignity of being judged by her work instead of her circumstances. It was Ruth Miller who finally addressed it directly, stopping by the cabin on a sweltering afternoon with a basket of tomatoes from her garden. "There's talk," Ruth said without preamble, settling into one of Lena's chairs. About you and Caleb Mercer. There's always talk. This is different. Some of the mothers are concerned that you're setting a bad example. A widow entertaining a man, letting him help around your property, being seen together in town. Lena's hand stilled on the beans she'd been snapping. He's never been here without a chaperone. We've never done anything improper. I fail to see how accepting help from a kind man constitutes a bad example. I know that. You know that. But perception matters, especially for a teacher. Ruth leaned forward. I'm on your side, Lena. I think you're going to be excellent at this job. But I need you to understand that you're being held to a different standard than a man would be. It's not fair, but it's reality. So what do you suggest? That I tell Caleb to stop helping? That I pretend he doesn't exist? I suggest you be even more careful than you already are. And I suggest you think about what you really want from him, because this situation can't continue indefinitely. Either he's courting you properly with intent to marry, or he's not. The town needs to know which it is. After Ruth left, Lena sat with her head in her hands and tried to sort through the tangle of her feelings. Did she want Caleb courting her? The thought made her stomach flutter with something that might have been excitement or might have been terror. She liked him, more than liked him. When he was near, she felt safer, happier, more herself. When he left, she missed him. But missing someone and wanting to marry them were vastly different things. She'd married Grant too quickly, too young, for too many wrong reasons. She wouldn't make that mistake again. That evening, when Caleb stopped by with fresh trout he'd caught and an offer to cook them for dinner if she didn't mind, Lena made a decision. We need to talk, she said. Something in her tone made him set down the fish and give her his full attention. All right. People are talking about us, about whether we're courting, about whether I'm being inappropriate. Ruth Miller came by today to warn me that I'm being judged differently because I'm a woman and a teacher, and she's right. Lena took a breath. I can't afford to lose this position, Caleb. Maisie and I depend on it, which means I need to be above reproach. I understand. Do you? Because I'm not sure I do. I don't know what we're doing here. I don't know if you're helping because you feel obligated, or because you're courting me, or because we're friends, or some combination of all three. And I need to know. I need clarity, because the town needs clarity, and I can't navigate this uncertainty while trying to prove I can handle 25 students. Caleb was quiet for a long moment, his jaw working. When he finally spoke, his voice was careful. What do you want me to say? The truth. What do you want from me? Everything. The word came out raw. I want to court you properly, with your permission and the town's knowledge. I want to build something real with you, at a pace that respects what you've been through. I want to be there when Maisie takes her first steps, when you teach your first class, when Montana throws its worst at you. I want to prove that I'm nothing like Grant Hart, that I'll show up and stay and do the work that love requires. But I can't want those things at you. You have to want them too, or at least be willing to consider wanting them someday. Lena's heart was pounding so hard she could barely breathe. I'm terrified. Of me? Of getting it wrong again. Of trusting when I shouldn't. Of needing someone and having them disappoint me. She blinked back tears. Of feeling this much after I promised myself I wouldn't feel anything at all. Caleb crossed the small space between them and took her hands in his calloused palms warm against her skin. I can't promise I'll never disappoint you. I'm human, and humans mess up, but I can promise I'll try my damnedest to be worthy of your trust. And I can promise that if I mess up, I'll own it and fix it, instead of running or blaming you or drowning it in whiskey. That's a low bar. Maybe, but it's the bar that matters to you, and I'll clear it every day for the rest of my life if you'll let me. Lena looked at their joined hands, then up at his face, and saw nothing but sincerity in his eyes. He meant it, every word. Okay, she whispered. Okay? Court me. Properly. Slowly. With the whole town watching and judging and gossiping. We'll do everything right, by every rule they've ever invented. And maybe, if we're both very lucky and very careful, we'll figure out if this is real or just two broken people clinging to each other in the wreckage. His smile was bright enough to light the dimming cabin. I can work with maybe. And when he left that night, after cooking those trout and eating dinner with perfect propriety, While Ella looked on with undisguised approval, Lena stood at her door and watched him walk away and let herself hope. Hope that this time, this man, this choice would be different. Hope that she was finally learning to tell the difference between rescue and partnership, between need and want, between settling and choosing. Hope that the life she was building, one plank, one lesson, one careful step at a time, was sturdy enough to hold not just her and Maisie, but maybe, someday, something more. September arrived with the kind of crystalline mornings that made Montana look like it had been painted fresh overnight, all gold aspens and blue sky sharp enough to cut. Lena stood at the schoolhouse door on that first Monday, her hands trembling slightly as she watched families arrive, fathers on horseback, mothers in wagons, children walking in clusters, all of them converging on this single room that would become the center of her world for the next 9 months. 27 students filed in, not the 25 she'd expected. 2 families had decided at the last minute that a widow teacher was better than no teacher at all. The children ranged from 6-year-old Emma Chen, tiny and solemn with her black braids and serious eyes, to 16-year-old James Peterson, tall and slouching and clearly resentful at being forced back to school when he'd rather be working his father's claim. Lena took attendance, her voice steady despite the nerves singing through her blood. She established rules: respect, honesty, effort. She divided the students into groups by age and ability. She taught her first lesson on Montana Territory geography, using maps she'd drawn herself and stories that made the children lean forward in their seats. By noon recess, her throat was dry and her back ached from bending over the smallest children's work. But when she stepped outside and saw them playing together, the older ones helping the younger, laughter rising into the clear air, she felt something settle deep in her chest. This was right. This was hers. This was the life she'd chosen, and it was good. Caleb appeared at 3 o'clock, just as she was dismissing the students, leading a mare with a distinctive white blaze. The children swarmed him immediately, asking questions about the horse, begging to pet her, and he answered each one with patience that surprised Lena. She'd known he was good with horses, but she hadn't realized he was equally good with children. Miss Hart asked if I'd come talk about horses, he told the students, though Lena had done no such thing. I thought I'd introduce you to Luna here, and tomorrow I can tell you about reading animal behavior, if your teacher approves. Every eye turned to Lena. She fought back a smile. I think that would be very educational. Tomorrow at 2 o'clock, Mr. Mercer. The children cheered and scattered toward their waiting families, leaving Lena and Caleb alone in the schoolyard with the patient mare between them. You didn't ask me to come, he said, not quite making it a question. No, but I'm glad you did. They loved it. And you? Did you love your first day? Lena looked back at the schoolhouse, at the imperfect letters still visible on the chalkboard, at the scattered primers and slates that needed organizing. I loved it more than I knew how to love anything except Maisie. Is that strange? No, that's what it looks like when you're doing what you're meant to do. He adjusted Luna's bridle. I brought something for you, for your cabin, if you want it. What kind of something? The kind you should see before deciding. They walked to her cabin together, Luna trailing behind, and Lena was aware of curtains twitching in windows, of conversations pausing as they passed. Let them watch. Caleb was courting her properly now, with Sunday dinners at Ella's boarding house where half the town could observe, with Saturday walks along the creek always accompanied by Sarah or one of the church ladies, with a propriety so careful it sometimes made Lena want to scream. But it was working. The gossip was dying down, replaced by grudging acceptance that maybe the widow teacher wasn't as scandalous as initially feared. Behind her cabin, Caleb had built something while she'd been at school. A chicken coop, sturdy and well-constructed, with 6 hens already pecking contentedly in their new home. Eggs, he said simply. For you and Maisie. These are good layers. You'll get 4 or 5 eggs a day, enough to eat some and sell the rest for extra money. Lena stared at the coop, at the chickens, at this man who kept finding new ways to take care of her without making her feel like charity. I can't. You can. You need protein for Maisie, and eggs are expensive at the mercantile. This is practical, not romantic, though I'll admit the hen house is handsomer than strictly necessary. He pointed out the details, the roosting bars, the nesting boxes, the small door that would make collecting eggs easy. I'll show you how to care for them, and in a few weeks you won't even need me for that." But Lena was beginning to realize she'd need him for other things. Things that had nothing to do with chickens or repairs or practical help. Things that terrified her with their intensity. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For this. For everything." "You're welcome. Now I should go before people start counting how long I've been here." But he paused at the fence, looking back. "You were magnificent today, from what I saw. Those children are lucky to have you." After he left, Lena stood in her small yard with her chickens in her cabin and her daughter napping inside and let herself acknowledge what she'd been refusing to see. She was falling in love with Caleb Mercer. Not the desperate, drowning love she'd felt for Grant, but something steadier and deeper, something that felt like coming home. The weeks that followed established a rhythm that felt almost dangerously normal. Lena taught 5 days a week, pouring herself into lessons that ranged from basic alphabet work with the youngest to advanced mathematics with James Peterson, who turned out to be brilliant when he wasn't being surly. The children tested her constantly those first weeks, talking out of turn, incomplete work, small rebellions to see if she'd crack. She didn't. She remained firm and fair, and gradually the testing stopped, replaced by genuine effort and even, occasionally, enthusiasm. Caleb came every Tuesday and Thursday after school to teach about horses, tracking, reading weather signs, all the practical knowledge the children would need. The students adored him, and Lena found herself watching him with the younger ones, patient with their questions, gentle when they were nervous around the horses, proud when they got something right. He'd make a good father, she thought, then immediately pushed the thought away as too soon, too much, too dangerous. On Sundays, they sat together at church, proper and public, and afterward walked to the cemetery where Grant was buried. It had become a ritual neither of them had discussed but both maintained. Lena would stand at the grave for a few minutes, Maisie in her arms, and try to feel something beyond the complicated relief of his absence. Caleb would wait at a respectful distance, never pushing, never asking what she was thinking. One October Sunday, with leaves falling like gold coins and frost silvering the grass, Lena finally spoke at the graveside. "I forgive you," she said to the wooden marker, "for being weak when I needed strength, for choosing whiskey over your family, for leaving us vulnerable and alone. I forgive you because holding on to anger takes energy I need for living." She adjusted Maisie on her hip. "Your daughter will grow up knowing you loved her, even if you didn't know how to show it. That's the best I can offer." Wait, Caleb was silent on the walk back to town, but when they reached her cabin, he said, "That took courage." "It took letting go. That's different from courage." "No, it's not. Letting go is the bravest thing we ever do." November brought the first real snow, and with it, trouble. James Peterson stopped coming to school. When Lena visited his family's claim, she found him working alongside his father, both of them hostile to her interference. "Boys needed here," Frank Peterson said, not meeting her eyes. "Can't spare him for book learning when there's real work to be done." "James is gifted at mathematics," Lena insisted. "With proper education, he could become a surveyor, an engineer, something beyond—" She stopped, but the words hung anyway. Something beyond scraping survival from reluctant soil. "Beyond what his father is?" Frank's voice went cold. "We don't need your charity opinions about our choices, Mrs. Hart. James stays here." Lena returned to town, furious and helpless. She complained to Ruth Miller, who sighed and said some families were like that. You couldn't change them. She mentioned it to Pastor Williams, who promised to speak with Frank but held little hope of success. She stewed over it for 3 days before Caleb noticed her distraction during one of their carefully chaperoned Sunday dinners. "What's eating at you?" he asked as they walked along the creek afterward, Sarah trailing behind at a discreet distance. Lena told him about James, about the waste of watching a brilliant mind get buried under farm work and his father's resentment. "I can't just accept it. That boy deserves better." "You're right, he does, but you can't force people to value education if they've decided it's useless." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "Though there might be another way." "What way?" "I need help with my horses. The work's getting to be more than I can handle alone, especially through winter. I could hire James, pay him fair wages to work afternoons and Saturdays. His father can't object to that, and it would keep the boy from working dawn to dusk on the claim. Might give him enough breathing room to keep up with his studies on his own. You don't need help. You've managed fine for years. Maybe I'm tired of managing alone. Maybe I'm ready to teach someone the trade. He looked at her directly. And maybe I care about the things you care about, which includes that kid's future. The arrangement was made within a week. James started working for Caleb 3 afternoons and Saturdays, earning money that his father couldn't refuse. In exchange, Lena tutored James for 2 hours every Sunday after church, drilling him in advanced mathematics and science, loaning him books she ordered from her own limited funds. The boy blossomed under the attention, his surliness transforming into fierce determination. "I'm going to make something of myself," he told Lena one Sunday in December, his hands ink-stained from working geometry problems. "I'm going to prove education matters." "You already are," Lena said, and meant it. Christmas approached with the peculiar challenge of being Lena's first as a widow and Maisie's first in awareness. The baby was 8 months old now, sitting up and babbling and showing clear preferences for people and activities. Her face lit up whenever Caleb appeared, and Lena's heart twisted with the complicated knowledge that Maisie would have no memory of Grant, but might grow up calling another man father. The town organized a Christmas program at the church, and Lena's students performed recitations and songs they'd practiced for weeks. Watching them on that stage, nervous and proud and doing their best, Lena felt tears sting her eyes. These were her children now, as surely as Maisie was. She was shaping their futures, giving them tools their parents couldn't provide, opening windows onto possibilities beyond survival. After the program, Caleb found her in the crowd and handed her a small wrapped package. "For Maisie," he said. "Well, for both of you, really." Inside was a carved wooden horse, small enough for a baby's hands, sanded smooth and detailed with care that spoke of hours of work. Maisie grabbed it immediately, gumming it with delight. "It's beautiful," Lena whispered. "I wanted her to have something that would last, something to remember." He stopped, seeming to reconsider his words. "Something to play with." But Lena knew what he'd almost said. Something to remember me by if this courtship ended. If Lena decided she couldn't take the risk. If the careful structure they'd built collapsed like her cabin had collapsed, sudden and devastating. "I have something for you too," she said, pulling a package from her bag. "It's not much." Inside was a scarf she'd knitted from wool she'd bought with egg money, dark blue like his eyes, long enough to wrap twice around his neck against Montana winters. He held it like it was precious, his expression unreadable. "No one's made me anything since my mother died," he said finally. "Then it's long overdue." They stood together in the crowded church basement, surrounded by celebration and community, and Lena felt the distance between them shrinking. Not because either of them had moved, but because the space itself was changing, becoming something shared instead of carefully maintained. January brought bitter cold and a crisis that tested everything Lena had built. Little Emma Chen stopped coming to school. When 3 days passed with no word, Lena bundled Maisie against the cold and walked to the Chen family's mercantile, ignoring her students' worried faces. Henry Chen met her at the door, his usual businesslike demeanor cracked with exhaustion. "She's sick. Fever, cough. My wife is with her." "May I see her?" He hesitated, then nodded. Emma lay in a small room behind the mercantile, her tiny body burning with fever, her breathing labored. Mrs. Chen sat beside her, wringing out cloths in cool water, her eyes red from crying or lack of sleep or both. "The doctor's been," Henry said quietly. "He says there's nothing to do but wait and pray. Either the fever breaks or—" He couldn't finish the sentence. Lena knew that sentence ended with the word that haunted every parent on the frontier. "Or she dies." "Let me help," Lena said. "I can sit with her, give you both breaks. I've nursed fever before." She stayed for 6 hours that first day, spooning water between Emma's cracked lips, singing softly, holding the little girl's hot hand. She returned the next day, and the next, bringing Maisie with her, teaching her other students in the morning, and spending afternoons in that small room fighting death with nothing but stubbornness and care. On the 4th day, Caleb appeared at the mercantile with broth made from bones he'd simmered all night. "Ella said you hadn't eaten. Said you've been here more than your own cabin." I can't leave her. She's 6 years old and she's terrified and her parents are exhausted and someone needs to. Lena's voice broke. Someone needs to be you. I understand. But you're no good to Emma if you collapse. He pressed the warm jar into her hands. Eat. I'll sit with her while you do. They traded off that way for 3 more days, Caleb and Lena and Ella and half the women in town, everyone taking shifts so the Chens could rest, and Emma was never alone. The school stayed closed, lessons suspended, everything waiting on one little girl's fight for life. On the 7th day, the fever broke. Emma opened her eyes, weak but clear, and asked for water in a voice like dried grass. Her mother sobbed. Her father gripped Lena's hand so hard it hurt. And Lena walked out of that mercantile into the January cold and let herself shake with the relief of it. Caleb was waiting with his wagon, blankets piled in the back. Come on, you're dead on your feet. I need to get back to Maisie. Ella's been watching her too long. Ella's fine and Maisie's asleep. You need sleep too, but first you need air that doesn't smell like sick room. He helped her into the wagon, wrapped blankets around her, and drove out of town toward his homestead. The house was warm when they arrived, the fire already laid and burning. Caleb settled Lena in his one comfortable chair and brought her tea sweetened with honey. You saved that little girl's life, he said. The doctor saved her. The fever broke on its own. You loved her through it. You showed her she was worth fighting for, worth sitting with, worth caring about. Don't diminish that. Lena sipped her tea and looked around Caleb's house, really seeing it for the first time. The furniture he'd built himself, sturdy and simple. The books on the shelf. Not many, but well-worn and valued. The kitchen area kept neat, the bed in the corner made with military precision. It was a home built for one person, but with space for more, waiting. Why haven't you married? She asked suddenly. You're 32, established, kind. You could have had your pick of women. Because I was waiting for the right one. Because I knew what I wanted wasn't just a wife, but a partner. Someone strong enough to build a life with instead of someone who needed me to build it for them. He sat across from her. And because Montana is hard on marriages. I've seen too many fail because people were desperate instead of certain. I wanted to be certain. And are you? Certain? About you? Yes. About us? That's not just my decision to make. Lena set down her tea with shaking hands. I'm terrified of getting this wrong, of trusting the wrong person again, of needing someone who'll disappoint me. Those are all valid fears. But fear isn't a reason to run from something good. It's a reason to move carefully, which we've been doing. We've been courting for 5 months now, Lena. 5 months of proper visits and supervised walks, and me proving over and over that I show up, I stay, I keep my word. At some point, you have to decide if that's enough evidence or if no amount of evidence will ever convince you. She looked at him across the small space of his house, this man who'd pulled her from wreckage and had been pulling her toward solid ground ever since. He was right. He'd been steady and patient and kind. He'd proven himself in every way that mattered. The question wasn't whether he was trustworthy, but whether she was brave enough to trust him anyway. I'm not ready to marry, she said slowly. Not yet. But I'm ready to stop being afraid of wanting to. His smile was sunrise bright. That's enough. That's more than enough. February brought a thaw, and with it Caleb's formal proposal to court her with intent to marry. He asked Pastor Williams first, old-fashioned and proper, then asked Lena in her cabin with Ella as witness, and Maisie playing on the floor between them. I'm asking permission to build a future with you, he said. Not next week or next month, but when you're ready, when you're certain. I'm asking you to choose me, knowing I'm choosing you every day for the rest of my life. Lena looked at Maisie, who was gleefully destroying a pile of blocks Caleb had made for her. Looked at Ella, who was pretending not to cry. Looked at Caleb, patient and steady and sure. Yes, she said. Yes to building a future. Yes to choosing each other. Yes to taking the time to get it right. The engagement wasn't announced officially. That would wait until Lena was ready for marriage. But word spread anyway because in Silver Creek, nothing stayed secret long. The response was mixed. Some celebrated, happy to see the widow teacher finding happiness. Others worried it was too soon, too fast, too scandalous. A few fathers grumbled about whether a courting woman could properly focus on teaching their children. Lena proved them wrong by having her best term yet. Her students thrived. James Peterson passed equivalency exams that would let him apply to engineering programs, and when May came and school ended, every parent agreed to renew her contract for the following year. "You've earned this town's respect," Ruth Miller told her at the end-of-year celebration. "Not by being perfect, but by being dedicated. That matters more." Summer brought long days of light and the hard work of preparing for the future. Caleb expanded his homestead, adding a room to the house that everyone pretended wasn't clearly meant for a child. Lena painted her cabin, planted a larger garden, raised chickens that now numbered 12 productive hens. They worked side by side on Saturdays, building a partnership that felt as important as any romance. And slowly, carefully, Lena let herself believe that this was real, that the life she was building wouldn't collapse, that the man beside her would stay. On a Sunday in late August, almost exactly a year since her cabin had fallen, Lena took Caleb to the cemetery one last time. "I'm ready," she told Grant's grave. "Ready to stop being your widow and start being someone else's wife. Ready to give Maisie a father who'll choose her every day. Ready to let go of who I was and become who I'm meant to be." She turned to Caleb, standing patient in the afternoon sun. "I want to marry you. Not because I need rescuing, but because I choose partnership. Not because I'm afraid of being alone, but because I'm ready to be together. Will you have me?" His answer was to drop to his knees right there in the cemetery, taking her hands in his. "I'll have you today, tomorrow, and every day after. I'll have you in joy and in hardship, in success and in struggle. I'll have you and Maisie and whatever life we build together. Yes, Lena Hart. Yes to everything." They married that autumn, on a September morning when the aspens were gold and the sky was impossibly blue. Maisie toddled down the aisle scattering wildflowers, and when she reached Caleb, he scooped her up and held her on his hip while he made his vows. The whole town came to witness, even Frank Peterson, even the gossips who'd doubted, everyone gathering to celebrate the widow teacher and the horse wrangler who'd found each other in the wreckage. The reception was held in the churchyard, long tables laden with food the town women had spent days preparing. Lena wore a dress Claire Peterson had sewn from cream-colored wool, simple and practical, but beautiful in its clean lines and careful stitching. Caleb wore his best suit, the one he'd bought 5 years ago for his father's funeral and had never worn since. And Lena thought he'd never looked more handsome than he did with Maisie on his hip and joy written plain across his face. "To the bride and groom," Pastor Williams called, raising his glass. "May their love be as enduring as these mountains and as fruitful as this good land." The toast was echoed by 50 voices, and Lena felt tears prick her eyes. A year and a half ago, she'd been trapped beneath a fallen beam, certain she was going to die. Now she stood surrounded by community, married to a man who'd proven his worth through steady action rather than empty promises, with a daughter who'd never remember the father who'd abandoned them, but would grow up knowing the one who'd chosen her. "You all right?" Caleb murmured, his free hand finding hers. "Better than all right. I'm happy." The word felt foreign and right all at once. "I'm actually genuinely happy." "Good, because I plan to keep you that way for the next 50 years at minimum." They moved into Caleb's homestead the following week, the house that had waited patient for a family finally receiving one. Lena brought her few possessions, the books and kitchen things, and the quilt Martha Johnson had made as a wedding gift. And they arranged everything together, making decisions about where things should go, learning the rhythm of shared space. The room Caleb had added became Maisie's, with the cradle he'd built positioned by the window where morning light would wake her gently. That first night in their own home, after Maisie had been settled and the lamps turned low, Lena stood at the window and looked out at the valley spread below. The mountains were dark shapes against a star-filled sky, eternal and indifferent to human joy or sorrow, beautiful precisely because of that indifference. "What are you thinking?" Caleb asked, coming up behind her, his hands gentle on her shoulders. "That I spent so much time afraid of needing someone that I forgot wanting someone was different. Better." She turned in his arms. "That I'm glad I was brave enough to choose this. To choose you. We chose each other. That's what makes it work." The autumn passed in a rhythm of work and contentment that Lena had never known was possible in marriage. She taught during the week, her second year proving easier than the first, now that she knew her students and their families, now that she'd established herself as capable and dedicated. Caleb worked his horses and began training James Peterson in earnest, the boy showing real talent for the trade. Evenings they spent together, Caleb reading aloud while Lena mended or planned lessons, Maisie playing at their feet or demanding stories or practicing the walking she'd recently mastered. It was ordinary and precious, this life they'd built. No grand drama, no desperate struggles, just the steady accumulation of good days that added up to something worth protecting. Winter brought challenges that tested their new marriage in ways neither had anticipated. A blizzard in December killed half their chickens, despite Caleb's best efforts to shelter them. In January, Lena caught influenza from one of her students and spent 2 weeks too sick to teach, forcing the school to close and worrying parents who depended on that education. In February, Caleb's best stallion broke a leg and had to be put down, a financial loss that hurt almost as much as the emotional one. But they weathered each crisis together, neither of them collapsing under the weight of hardship, both of them learning that partnership meant sharing burdens instead of bearing them alone. When Lena was sick, Caleb nursed her with the same patience she'd shown Emma Chen. When Caleb lost the stallion, Lena held him while he grieved, understanding that tears weren't weakness, but honest acknowledgement of loss. "This is what Grant never understood," Lena said one night after Caleb had finally talked through his sorrow over the horse. "That being strong doesn't mean feeling nothing. It means feeling everything and continuing anyway." "He was weak in ways that had nothing to do with feeling," Caleb said. "He was weak because he ran from responsibility instead of carrying it. Big difference." Spring of their second year brought news that changed everything. Lena was pregnant. She'd suspected for weeks but had waited to be certain, remembering the complicated emotions of her pregnancy with Maisie, the fear that Grant wouldn't care, the loneliness of carrying a child essentially alone, the knowledge that she'd have to be strong enough for two people because he certainly wouldn't be. This time was different. This time she told Caleb over breakfast on a Sunday morning, watching his face transform from confusion to wonder to fierce protective joy in the space of 3 heartbeats. "A baby," he breathed. "We're having a baby. Are you happy?" Happy doesn't begin to cover it. He came around the table and knelt beside her chair, his hands gentle on her still flat belly. Terrified, yes. Worried about you, absolutely. But happy most of all. "We're going to have a family, Lena. A real family that we built together." The pregnancy was easier than Lena's first, perhaps because this time she wasn't doing heavy farm labor or worrying constantly about money or dealing with a husband who resented her condition. Caleb treated her like precious cargo, which drove her to distraction until she reminded him firmly that pregnant women had been working and living for millennia without excessive coddling. "I'm growing a baby, not dying of consumption," she told him when he tried to prevent her from carrying a basket of laundry. "I can handle household tasks." "I know you can. Doesn't mean you should have to." They compromised, as they'd learned to do about most things. Lena continued teaching through May, her students delighted by the prospect of their teacher having a baby. She stopped in June, using the summer to prepare for the arrival and to train Sarah Brennan to take over the school in the fall while Lena recovered. "You'll come back?" Ruth Miller asked, worry creasing her face. "After the baby's born?" "We can't lose you, Lena." "I'll come back, maybe not until January, but yes, teaching is part of who I am now. I won't give it up." The baby came in late August, a son they named Thomas after Caleb's father, with dark hair and blue eyes and lungs that announced his arrival to half the county. Caleb held his son with shaking hands and tears streaming down his face, and Lena understood in that moment that this was what she'd been searching for all along. Not rescue, not security, but authentic partnership with someone who felt as deeply as she did and wasn't afraid to show it. Maisie, now 2.5, was fascinated by her baby brother. She brought him toys, sang to him in her toddler voice, and informed anyone who'd listen that Thomas was her baby and they were only borrowing him. Watching her daughter embrace her new family without any sense of loss for the father she'd never known, Lena felt the last piece of guilt about Grant's death finally release its hold. This was Maisie's real family, Caleb was her real father in every way that mattered. The past was past, and they were all better for having moved beyond it. October brought unexpected trouble when Frank Peterson appeared at the homestead, his face thunderous. James trailed behind him, sporting a black eye and a defiant expression. "Your teaching has ruined my son," Frank said without preamble. Filled his head with ideas above his station. Now he's telling me he's going to Helena for engineering school, leaving me to work the claim alone. "I'm 17, Pa," James said, "old enough to make my own choices." "You're old enough to honor your father and do your duty to this family." Caleb stepped forward, his posture calm but unmistakably protective. "James has been working for me for over a year, Frank. He's earned his own money. If he wants to use it for school, that's his right. You stay out of this, Mercer. This is family business." "Actually, it's James's business," Lena interjected, coming to stand beside Caleb with Thomas in her arms. "He's the one who did the work, earned the grades, secured the acceptance. All we did was provide opportunities. What he does with them is his choice." Frank's face reddened. "You think you're so high and mighty with your books and your fancy teaching? You're just a widow who got lucky landing a decent man. You don't know anything about real life, about real work." "I know about real work," Lena said quietly. "I know what it's like to have a cabin fall on you and keep fighting anyway. I know what it's like to raise a child alone with no money and no prospects. I know what it's like to build a life from absolute nothing. So don't talk to me about not understanding hardship, Frank Peterson. I've lived more of it than you'll ever comprehend." The silence that followed was profound. Frank looked at Lena as if seeing her for the first time, and something in his expression shifted. "You really think he can make it?" he asked finally. "In Helena? In engineering?" "I know he can. James has one of the finest mathematical minds I've ever encountered. He'll not just make it, he'll excel." Frank turned to his son, and the anger in his face warred with something else. Pride, maybe, or grief at losing the boy to a future beyond the claim. "You're really going?" "Yes, Pa, I have to, but I'll come back summers to help. I'm not abandoning you. I'm just becoming something more than what I'd be if I stayed." "Something more than me, you mean?" "Something different. Not better, just different." Father and son stared at each other for a long moment, and then Frank's shoulders sagged. "Your mother would have wanted this. She always said you were too smart for farm work." He reached out awkwardly and pulled James into a rough embrace. "You make something of yourself, boy. Make us proud." After they left, Lena leaned against Caleb and felt the weight of victory mixed with sorrow. James would leave Silver Creek, would build a life elsewhere, would become the engineer she'd known he could be. But his leaving meant the town lost another bright young mind, another person who might have stayed and built something here. "You can't save them all," Caleb said, reading her thoughts as he so often did. "Some of them have to leave to become who they're meant to be." "I know. Doesn't make it easier to watch them go." "No, but you gave him the tools to succeed wherever he goes. That's what teaching is, equipping people for futures you won't get to see." November brought another kind of challenge when Ella Brennan fell seriously ill. The woman who'd taken Lena in, who'd championed her, who'd become more mother than landlady, developed pneumonia that left her struggling to breathe and too weak to run the boarding house. Lena moved back into town temporarily, bringing Thomas and leaving Maisie with Caleb so she could nurse Ella and manage the boarding house business. For 3 weeks, Lena barely slept. She cooked for boarders, changed linens, kept accounts, and sat up nights with Ella, spooning broth and medicine and hope into the older woman. Sarah helped when she could, but at 15 she was still too young to shoulder the full burden. It fell to Lena to hold everything together. "You should be home with your babies," Ella whispered one night, her voice weak but stubborn. "My babies are fine with their father. You need me more right now. You've already repaid any debt." "This isn't debt. This is love. You were there when I had nothing. Now I'm here when you need everything. That's what family does." Ella's eyes filled with tears. "I never had a daughter, but if I had, I'd want her to be like you." "Then I'll be your daughter," Lena said simply. "And you'll recover because I'm not ready to lose another mother." Ella did recover, slowly and incompletely. She would never have the strength she'd once possessed, would need help running the boarding house from now on. But she lived, and Lena returned to the homestead with the quiet satisfaction of having honored the woman who'd first helped her. "You're building a different kind of family," Caleb observed one evening after Lena had finished reading a letter from Ella. "Not just us, but the whole town. Everyone you've helped, everyone who's helped you. It's all connected." That's what I needed, Lena realized. After Grant died, after the cabin fell, I thought I needed to be completely independent, to prove I could survive alone. But real strength isn't isolation. It's building connections strong enough to hold you when you fall. Christmas that year was the richest Lena had ever known, not in material wealth but in the fullness of love surrounding her. They hosted dinner at the homestead, inviting Ella and Sarah, Ruth Miller, and her family, even Frank and James Peterson, who was home from Helena for the holidays. The house was crowded and loud and chaotic, Maisie running wild with the other children, Thomas being passed from lap to lap, the adults talking over each other about politics and weather and the endless small dramas of frontier life. Lena stood in her kitchen in her house with her family, and felt grateful in a way that defied description. She'd lost everything and found more than she'd dreamed possible. She'd been broken and had healed stronger. She'd needed rescue and had become someone who rescued others in turn. "Happy?" Caleb asked, stealing a moment alone with her while the others were distracted. "Profoundly, completely, in ways I never knew existed." He kissed her forehead. "Good, because we're just getting started." The years that followed established the pattern of their life together. Lena taught school 9 months a year, raising up students who would become teachers and engineers, ranchers and shopkeepers, passing on not just knowledge but the belief that they could become more than their circumstances suggested. Some stayed in Silver Creek, others left for Helena or Denver or points beyond. All of them carried pieces of what Lena had taught them about perseverance and dignity and the quiet strength it took to build a good life. Caleb's horse operation grew, aided by James Peterson's engineering skills in designing better facilities and by the reputation Caleb had earned for fair dealing and quality stock. He trained 3 more apprentices over the years, each one learning not just the trade but the philosophy behind it, respecting the animals, reading the land, understanding that patience yielded better results than force ever could. They had 2 more children, a daughter named Ellen after Ella Brennan, and another son they called William. Maisie grew into a serious, thoughtful girl who loved books as much as her mother did and showed talent for mathematics that made Lena think she might become a teacher herself someday. Thomas was all energy and curiosity, constantly bringing home injured animals for his father to heal, showing the same gift with horses that Caleb possessed. The younger children were still small, still requiring constant attention, still in that precious stage where every day brought new words and new discoveries. The homestead expanded to accommodate them all, Caleb adding rooms as needed, always building with the same careful attention to quality he'd shown in the original structure. This house would last, would shelter generations if the children chose to stay. It was built on ground that wouldn't shift, with timber that wouldn't fail, by hands that knew the cost of poor construction and refused to repeat those mistakes. On a September morning 5 years after their wedding, Lena woke to find Caleb already up, standing at the window and watching the sunrise paint the mountains in shades of rose and gold. She joined him, fitting herself against his side in the way they'd learned to stand together, 2 separate people who'd chosen to build one life. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "About the day I pulled you out of that cabin. How terrified I was that I'd be too late. How grateful I am that I wasn't. I'm grateful too. For you. For this." She gestured at the house, the sleeping children, the life they'd built. For learning that love doesn't have to be desperate or dramatic to be real. Sometimes it's just steady and sure and always there. Like mountains. Like mountains, she agreed. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the day begin, and Lena thought about all the ways a life could change, how disaster could become opportunity, how loss could create space for something better, how the worst moment of your existence could lead directly to the best, if you were brave enough to keep moving forward instead of staying buried in the wreckage. Her first marriage had been built on sand, beautiful promises that dissolved the moment real life tested them. This marriage was built on rock, on the solid foundation of mutual respect and shared work and the determination to choose each other not just once but continuously, through every hardship, and every joy. "I love you," she said, the words still feeling new even after 5 years of saying them. "I love you too, today and every day after." He turned to kiss her properly, his hands gentle on her face. "Thank you for being brave enough to choose me. Thank you for being worthy of the choice." But behind them, they heard small feet pattering on the floor. Maisie, awake early as always, probably coming to ask for breakfast or to share some urgent 6-year-old observation about the world. Thomas would follow soon, and then the younger children, and the day would fill with the beautiful chaos of family life. There would be meals to prepare, and animals to feed, and lessons to plan, and the 1,000 small tasks that comprised ordinary existence. But for this moment, they stood together at the window and watched the light grow. Two people who'd found each other in the darkness and had built something bright enough to last. Lena had learned that independence wasn't isolation. It was choosing love freely instead of desperately. That strength wasn't in never needing help, but in being wise enough to accept it when offered. That the life worth living wasn't the one without hardship, but the one where hardship was faced together, where burdens were shared instead of borne alone. She'd learned that sometimes a collapse, whether of timber or of hope, was necessary to clear space for something better to grow. That bleeding hands could heal and brave hearts could love again. That family wasn't just blood, but choice, built through years of steady presence and mutual care. And she'd learned that the best love stories weren't the ones that ended with rescue, but the ones that began with it and then transformed into something more, into partnership and respect and the quiet daily choice to build a life worthy of keeping. The sun cleared the eastern peaks, flooding their valley with golden light, and in that illumination Lena saw the truth written across everything they'd built together. This was enough. This life, this love, this family they'd chosen and fought for and created against all odds. This was more than she'd dreamed possible when she'd been trapped beneath that beam, more than she'd dared hope for in those first desperate days as a widow, with nothing but a baby and borrowed clothes and the determined belief that she could survive. She hadn't just survived, she'd thrived. They both had. And they would continue to do so day by day, season by season, year by patient year, building their future on the lessons of the past and the love that had grown from wreckage into something unshakable and true. Behind them, Maisie appeared in the doorway, her hair wild from sleep, her face bright with the innocent joy of being 6 and loved. "Mama, Papa, look, the sky is all pink and gold. Can we have pancakes for breakfast? And can I help make them, please?" Caleb laughed and scooped his daughter into his arms, kissing her forehead. "Of course you can help. You're the best pancake helper in all of Montana Territory." "In the whole world," Maisie corrected seriously. "In the whole world," he agreed, his eyes meeting Lena's over their daughter's head, both of them sharing the private smile of parents who knew exactly how blessed they were. And as they moved toward the kitchen to start the day, toward the ordinary miracle of breakfast and laughter and family, Lena felt nothing but gratitude for the journey that had brought her here, for the cabin that fell and the hands that bled pulling her free, for the courage to trust again and the wisdom to choose well, for every hard day and every good one, each of them necessary, all of them adding up to this beautiful, imperfect, wholly sufficient life. This was the happy ending she'd never expected and couldn't have imagined. Not a fairy tale rescue, but a real story of real people choosing real love day after day, until the choosing became as natural as breathing and as essential as hope. And it was enough. More than enough. It was everything.